So I saw this situation with NBA guard Jaden Ivey and the Chicago Bulls, and I wanted to basically give my thoughts on the whole situation. I'm not necessarily a huge NBA fan, but I do like watching the Bucks. I know about Jaden Ivey's career. He was a Piston at first, traded very recently to the Bulls, went viral overnight basically for quote-unquote anti-LGBTQ rhetoric on Instagram Live, and shortly afterwards the Bulls cut him. I ended up watching the videos from his stream because I was pretty curious on what he was actually saying, and I didn't want to have headlines form my opinion on this situation. Plus, I was curious about his conversion to Christianity, how genuine that actually seemed. I find in these situations that a lot of people will make opinions on certain scenarios without really getting the full scope of what actually happened. And this one's pretty easy. All you need to do is watch his Instagram Live stream. But the problem is it's like a 42-minute long stream. I have some takeaways that I don't think a lot of other people are talking about. And I want to kind of share, once again, what I think about this situation, because I think a lot of the discussion has been about Jaden Ivey as a player and about, being biased against LGBTQ people. And I think that what's going on here is a lot more nuanced than just Jaden Ivey losing his mind on social media and then, of course, Chicago Bulls cutting him as a result of that. I watched the stream, and he does come out and say anti-LGBTQ stuff, but he also talks a lot more about many other things, not just LGBTQ, and his problems with the movement. He talks about it early on, and then for a good portion of that stream, like 15 to 20 minutes of it, he doesn't even touch it again until the very end. I'm going to be the first one to say that if I was a player in the NBA, I would also be pretty irritated at how this certain time of year is handled by the league. I understand wanting to be inclusive. I understand wanting to be tolerant and not hating people just for the sake of their sexual orientation or the color of their skin or their religious beliefs. All that makes a lot of sense to me. However, there is a difference between being tolerant and constantly needing to agree with every opinion and stance that a certain group that you might not identify with has. And I see that kind of sentiment being very common, that not only do you need to be tolerant of certain groups that you might not identify with, that you wouldn't consider an in-group, but you also need to agree with all of their stances and act as if they're own. And this has been going on for years. I just find it incredibly hypocritical of the league to be okay with this idea that we can cut a player for having negative opinions about a certain group of people, but yet someone who literally commits domestic abuse and has been found guilty of committing domestic abuse is still allowed to play in the league despite the actions being far worse than anything Jaden Ivey has ever said about anyone. Of course, as you can imagine, I'm referencing players such as Miles Bridges. Now, Miles Bridges still might have a place in the league in terms of his pure talent and the ability to play basketball. I'm not going to try to argue that. I think the guy actually is pretty talented. However, I don't think he belongs in the league whatsoever, especially given that we can cut players for saying things, but when someone's actually beating women, now all of a sudden it's okay. I understand it's also two different organizations. That doesn't mean that there's not a double standard here. We've seen all kinds of players come out with their activism from the NBA, the WNBA, the NFL. As we all can remember, the NFL had this big, stop racism campaign, which was mostly spearheaded or at least initiated by the Colin Kaepernick situation. And, that was supposed to be such an eye-opening scenario for the public to view. Oh my gosh, real people are behind Colin Kaepernick's back. Oh my gosh. And then there was this whole story about how Colin Kaepernick was being blackballed by the league because of his stance when you had dozens and dozens of players supporting him publicly, and Colin Kaepernick was unable to get signed to another team. Was there any bias there? There may have been, honestly. There may have been a little bit of bias from certain teams in terms of why they didn't want to sign Colin Kaepernick, probably because the headache would be worth more than what he is able to perform on the field for. But, there's something to be said about that, where Colin Kaepernick, for what you might be able to consider him being blackballed on, he sure had a lot of people helping him out and speaking in favor of him, and none of those players were chastised or fined or anything like that, at least that I can recall. I don't think anyone got a fine for putting the knee down during the national anthem. I don't think anyone got a fine for defending Colin Kaepernick's stance, nor should they, I would argue, because this country is founded on something called free speech. And it's been quite the trend over the past 25 years where, free speech has been kind of slowly eroded away against as long as you have the wrong opinions, quote unquote. The wrong opinions being basically anything that is not part of the woke agenda, whatever you want to consider that. The thing with the Ivey situation that I really want to talk about is that I think that Jaden Ivey is for real. I don't think he's losing his mind. I don't think that he's off the deep end, and I don't think that I hope, I should say, that he is not going to reverse these opinions just for social media clout. I think that this guy has probably actually come to Jesus as a sinner, and I think that's a great thing. I really, really applaud Jaden Ivey for finding himself, finding God, and standing up for his beliefs, as long as that's actually what's happening. I definitely cannot pretend to know every single facet of the scenario here, but when I watch the videos and I watch the streams, Jaden Ivey, he does come across as being the real deal. It's quite disappointing to see someone who is finally standing up for themselves in the face of this nationwide agenda that is being pushed down everyone's throat through every source of media imaginable. I realize that Jaden Ivey has some injuries, and I realize that Jaden Ivey also is not quite the player that he was maybe in his first 2 or 3 seasons. I actually am not entirely sure how long he's been in the league, but he's been with the Pistons for a little bit, and I think the main reason why he was traded from the Pistons was probably because he had a history of getting injured and not being able to play, and it's really tough to keep someone on the roster that has trouble showing up to games when you need him to. I think he's talented as a player. I also think that, the injury bug has kind of bit him in the butt a little bit, and I hope that it's not for an extended period of time again, but his knees have been a little bit of an issue for him so far in his career. Maybe the Bulls had a reason to cut him based off of maybe a drop in talent, a drop in skill. It does seem like he maybe lost a step compared to a few years ago when he was a lot quicker. All that aside, I think he's still a valuable basketball player to have on your team as a rotational piece at the very least right now. Maybe the Bulls see something different. The timing of this Instagram Live being uploaded and then him being cut a day later, it doesn't really pass a smell test to me. He's spending time talking about the lifestyles that he's seeing among his teammates, his coworkers in the league, and he's kind of disgusted by it. He talks about, being sick of seeing people cheat on their wives, sick of seeing players sleep with 15 women, sick of seeing players abuse drugs in their free time. And that, to me, kind of proves the point that it's not just a decision he made to get on Instagram Live and start rambling about gay people because he hates them. I think he is convicted. I think that he is trying to understand God more, and I think that he's coming to some truths. And not a lot of people like that when you do that. When you start criticizing sin and criticizing blatant issues in society and relating it back to the moral code of the Bible, the moral code of Scripture, people end up really hating you for that. And I think that he's getting a taste of that right now. All in all, I would love to see Jaden Ivey come back to the league and be an excellent player on the court. I think that his social media situation, it may have been avoidable, but I also think that him speaking his mind, him putting himself out there as being against this whole push, there's a lot of different things I could say about this. There's so much that I saw growing up of quote-unquote wokeness being pushed on me and other kids my age when we were very young from institutions like school, institutions like the church. There's been a huge push for decades now to completely turn societal norms on its own head for the sake of inclusivity and feeling like a good person, basically. And a lot of it is hypocrisy. A lot of it is fake. And it's only done to look good. And I think Jaden Ivey sees through this. He may not have articulated it as well as he could have, but he articulated what he did in a way that he knew how, and he suffered the consequences for it. It's another classic example of how free speech in this country is mostly a myth as long as you agree with the quote-unquote right opinions. I would love to see this guy have another opportunity at playing pro basketball, but more importantly, I think not giving in is the answer. That's pretty much everything I have for this video. If you have anything that is useful, anyways, hope you're all having a good one.